You will never make a dime playing with those little apps. At an exclusive Manhattan dinner, my father tossed a crumpled $100 bill onto my plate, mocking my empty wallet in front of his wealthy board members. He was the arrogant CEO of a legacy stock brokerage obsessed with high society. Suddenly, his most critical banking partner stood up, ignoring my father entirely. "Actually, Ms. Grace is now a billionaire," the man said, bowing his head to me. I smiled as my father's face turned completely pale. He had absolutely no idea I was the one pulling the strings behind everything. "My name is Grace, and I am 35 years old. Before I reveal how this Christmas Eve dinner destroyed my toxic family's empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to sit quietly while your own blood tried to humiliate you for their own amusement." Growing up in an affluent neighborhood in Westchester, New York, my family was entirely obsessed with optics. To the outside world, we were the pinnacle of success and high society. My father, Reginald, had built a highly profitable legacy stock brokerage from the ground up. He commanded every room he entered with tailored suits and a booming voice that left no room for dissent. My mother, Vivian, dedicated her entire existence to maintaining our flawless social facade. She hosted charity galas, curated our elite country club memberships, and ensured that every family photo looked like a spread in a luxury lifestyle magazine. But inside our sprawling estate, love was strictly conditional. You were only as valuable as the prestige you brought to the family name. I was the middle child and the designated disappointment. While my father built his wealth pushing high-fee, outdated financial products to the ultra-rich, I preferred coding, studying financial algorithms, and building software. I wanted to create an ethical lending and investment platform designed to bring financial inclusion to marginalized communities. My parents saw no value in uplifting the very people they tried so hard to distance themselves from. To them, my mission was not just foolish, it was an embarrassment. They demanded compliance. When I refused to take a lowly administrative assistant job at my father's firm right out of college, preferring to build my own financial technology startup, my father cut me off completely. He told me I was a naive girl who would come crawling back the moment I could not pay my rent. I never did. Tonight was Christmas Eve, and our family dinner was being held in a private dining room at one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Outside, heavy snow fell against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blanketing the city in white. Inside the room was warm, filled with the scent of roasted duck, expensive truffles, and aged wine. But the atmosphere at our table was suffocatingly tense. This was not a cozy holiday gathering. Reginald had invited the senior board members of his firm, turning our family dinner into a high-stakes corporate networking event. He was desperately trying to secure a partnership with a massive investment bank to save his struggling brokerage. I sat near the end of the long mahogany table, wearing a simple, elegant black dress. My mother, Vivian, sat to my left, draped in diamonds and designer silk. She had spent the first hour of dinner policing my every move, whispering harsh criticisms under her breath. She told me my hair was not styled formally enough for the guests, that my dress lacked designer labels, and that my quiet demeanor was making the family look bad. She cared more about the opinions of the wealthy executives at the table than she cared about her own daughter's comfort. I just nodded and focused on my water glass, accustomed to the constant barrage of microaggressions. Across from me sat my sister Jasmine. She was the undisputed golden child of the family. Jasmine had done everything right according to my parents' strict playbook. She married a white man named Preston, who was promptly handed a lucrative vice president position at my father's firm. They lived in a $500,000 condo that my father had purchased for them as a wedding gift. Jasmine spent the evening dominating the conversation, flashing her massive diamond ring, and loudly complaining about the renovations on her summer house in the Hamptons. Preston sat beside her, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, wearing a smug expression that rarely left his face. He possessed a profound lack of talent, yet he operated with an unmatched level of arrogance simply because he had married into my father's wealth. As the waitstaff cleared our main courses to prepare for dessert, my father decided it was time for his favorite holiday tradition. He loved to assert his dominance by humiliating me in front of an audience. Reginald leaned back in his leather chair, reached into his tailored suit jacket, and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. The room grew quiet as he held it up, making sure every board member was watching him. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, he tossed the money down the length of the table. It slid across the pristine white linen and landed directly on my dessert plate. "Take it, Grace," my father announced, his booming voice echoing off the paneled walls. "I know your little tech hobby does not pay well, and I would hate for my daughter to freeze on the streets. You will need subway fare to get back to whatever shoebox apartment you are renting these days." A few of the board members chuckled nervously, eager to please their CEO. My mother gave my knee a sharp kick under the table, her eyes silently ordering me to swallow my pride. "Take the money and thank my father for his generosity." She hissed quietly, warning me not to cause a scene and ruin the aesthetic of the evening. Before I could even react, Preston leaned forward, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Honestly, Grace, you should have just swallowed your pride and taken that assistant job Reginald offered you years ago. I just got my holiday bonus cleared today, a cool $500,000. You could have been managing my calendar and fetching my coffee instead of starving in obscurity, trying to build software nobody wants." Jasmine laughed her sharp musical laugh, reaching over to pat Preston's arm affectionately. "Preston is completely right," she chimed in, projecting her voice so the entire room could hear her condescension. "It is honestly exhausting having you show up to these dinners looking like a charity case, Grace. We are trying to maintain a certain high society image here. Family shares everything, of course, but we simply cannot share class. You bring down the entire aesthetic of the evening." They sat there staring at me, waiting for me to break. For 35 years, this was the exact dynamic that defined my existence. They thrived on making me shrink. They bonded over my perceived failures. They wanted me to lower my head, pick up the crumpled bill, and accept my role as the family loser. In the past, I might have stayed silent just to survive the night. I might have let the humiliation wash over me to keep the peace. But tonight was different. Tonight, I did not shrink. I did not look down. I kept my posture perfectly straight and looked directly at the $100 bill resting on my plate. Then my gaze shifted down the table to the guest of honor, Elias Thorne. Elias was a titan in the investment banking world. He was a distinguished older African-American man with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and brilliant financial strategy. My father had spent the entire evening desperately trying to impress him. Reginald had poured Elias the most expensive vintage wines, agreed with every opinion Elias voiced, and practically begged for his bank to partner with the brokerage. My father's firm was quietly bleeding money, and Elias's partnership was the only lifeline that could keep Reginald's legacy afloat. I calmly reached out and picked up the $100 bill. I smoothed out the crease with my thumbs, making sure my movements were slow and deliberate. I looked my father dead in the eyes, refusing to break eye contact. With a steady hand, I slid the money smoothly back across the table toward him. "Keep it, Dad," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the silent room. "You are going to need it much more than I do." My father's face flushed a deep, angry red. His eyes widened in shock at my public defiance. Vivian gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace as if I had just committed a physical assault. Reginald planted his hands on the table, opening his mouth to deliver a crushing reprimand that would undoubtedly banish me from the family forever. But before a single word could escape his lips, the unexpected happened. Elias Thorne pushed his chair back and stood up. The entire room froze in anticipation. My father immediately changed his demeanor, masking his anger with a wide, desperate smile, thinking Elias was standing to make a toast or finalize their partnership. Reginald reached his hand out toward the powerful banker. Elias completely ignored my father's outstretched hand. He walked deliberately away from Reginald, his expensive leather shoes silent against the carpet, moving down the length of the long dining table. The board members watched in stunned silence. Elias did not stop until he reached my chair. He turned to face the room, standing firmly by my side. He looked down at my father, and then with absolute respect, Elias bowed his head slightly. My father stood there with his hand extended toward Elias Thorne, a practiced smile plastered across his face. He fully expected the legendary investment banker to shake his hand, perhaps offer a toast to their upcoming partnership, and validate my father's entire existence in front of his wealthy board members. Instead, Elias let my father's hand hang in the empty air. Elias did not even look at him. He kept his focus entirely on me. He turned his body slightly to address the rest of the dining room, his voice calm, resonant, and carrying the absolute authority of a man who moved billions of dollars before breakfast. "Gentlemen, Vivian Reginald." Elias began, his tone formal. "It is my distinct honor to clarify the events of this morning. At precisely 9:30 a.m., the New York Stock Exchange welcomed its newest listing. Aegis Capital, a revolutionary financial technology firm, went public. The initial public offering was oversubscribed by a factor of 10. The stock opened at $85 a share and closed today at $120. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the long mahogany table. The board members' men who spent their lives analyzing markets and calculating wealth stopped chewing. They stopped drinking. Their eyes darted from Elias to me. Elias placed a steady, respectful hand on the back of my chair. As the sole founder and majority shareholder, retaining exactly 80% of the voting shares, Ms. Grace is not in need of subway fare. As of the market close today, her personal net worth has officially crossed $1.4 billion. She is the youngest African-American female billionaire in the country. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one moved. The only sound in the private dining room was the soft crackle of the fireplace and the distant hum of holiday music from the main restaurant. Then my father laughed. It was a harsh grating sound like glass grinding against stone. He clapped his hands together, once a desperate attempt to reclaim control of the room. Reginald looked around at his board members, his face flushed, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "Good one, Elias," my father boomed, forcing a wide, unnatural grin. "That is a brilliant holiday prank. I have to admit, you really had me going for a second. Grace, how much did you pay him to come here and say this? Did you drain whatever little savings you had left to rent a suit and stage this little theater?" My mother moved with terrifying speed. Underneath the heavy linen tablecloth, Vivian's manicured fingers clamped down on my forearm like a vice. Her acrylic nails dug sharply into my skin. She leaned in close, the scent of her expensive Chanel perfume overwhelming her voice, a venomous, frantic whisper meant only for my ears. "Stop this right now!" she hissed, her teeth clenched behind a frozen, pageant-ready smile. "You are embarrassing our brand, Grace. We are the picture of Black excellence in this city. We are on the board of the country club. We are the legacy. You are making us look like unhinged fools in front of these men. Call off this stunt before your father throws you out into the snow." I did not pull my arm away. I slowly turned my head to look at my mother. I stared into her panicked, status-obsessed eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but pity. I reached under the table, gripped her wrist, and calmly pried her fingers off my arm one by one. I turned back to my father. He was still standing, his forced laughter dying in his throat as none of his board members joined in. They were looking at Elias, realizing that a man of his stature did not play parlor tricks. "You think this is a prank?" I said, my voice steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You think I would pay for an illusion? Because that is exactly what you do, Dad. Your entire life is an illusion. Your firm is bleeding capital, your clients are aging out, and your methods are obsolete. Grace, shut your mouth this instant." Reginald barked, his authoritative facade cracking. "You do not speak to me about business. You are a dropout." "I am a founder," I corrected him sharply, my voice rising just enough to command the space. "You cut off my tuition when I was 22 because I refused to be a glorified secretary for Preston. You told me my algorithms were garbage. You called me a worthless dropout and said I would never be anything more than an assistant to a mediocre white man who barely passed his finance exams." Preston slammed his hand on the table, his face turning a blotchy red. "Watch your mouth, Grace," he spat, pointing a finger at me. I am a vice president at this firm. You are nothing but a bitter spinster living in a fantasy world. Security needs to escort her out before she ruins the rest of this evening." Jasmine chimed in immediately, her voice shrill and whiny. "Seriously, Dad, make her leave. She is ruining the entire aesthetic of my Christmas. I cannot believe she would come here and lie about having money. You literally bought me a $500,000 condo for my wedding, and she has been jealous of me ever since. It is pathetic." I looked at my sister taking in her diamond tennis bracelet and her designer gown. "You are right, Jasmine," I said smoothly. "Dad bought you a $500,000 condo while I slept on an air mattress in a roach-infested studio in Queens. He funded your luxury life while I built my financial models from a public library computer. But I am not jealous. I am grateful. Sleeping on that floor taught me how to build an empire. You only learned how to spend one." My father slammed both his fists onto the table, shaking the crystal wine glasses. "Enough of this nonsense," he roared. "I will not have my holiday dinner hijacked by a delusional girl. Elias, I apologize for my daughter's mental break. Please have a seat. Let us discuss the partnership." I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. The maitre d' led a line of 6 waitstaff into the room. They moved in perfect synchronization, each carrying a large domed silver platter. My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "Oh, thank goodness," the main course, she breathed, desperately trying to restore the high society normalcy she craved. "Gentlemen, please let us enjoy the duck." The waiters stepped behind each of the board members standing behind Preston Jasmine, my mother and my father. On my second nod, the waiters lifted the silver domes in unison. There was no roasted duck. There was no fine dining. Resting on the center of each silver tray was a thick, glossy black portfolio, embossed with the gold crest of Aegis Capital. The room went deathly still. The board members, driven by pure corporate instinct, immediately reached out and took the portfolios. They flipped them open. I watched their eyes scan the crisp legal documents inside. I watched their expressions shift from mild annoyance to absolute unadulterated shock. "What is this?" one of the senior board members whispered, his hands actually trembling as he read the first page. Preston grabbed his portfolio, flipping violently through the pages. "This is garbage," he shouted, looking frantically at my father. "Reginald, this is fake! She forged these documents. She is insane." My father grabbed his own copy. His eyes darted across the bold legal print. I watched the color completely drain from his face. The arrogant, booming patriarch vanished in a matter of seconds, replaced by a hollow, terrified old man. He looked up at me, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Grace," he stammered, his voice suddenly small. "Grace, what is this? What have you done?" I picked up the crumpled $100 bill he had thrown at me earlier. I folded it neatly and placed it into my designer clutch. I looked at the man who had spent his entire life making me feel small, and I smiled. "It is not a prank, Dad. And Elias isn't here for your firm's holiday party. He's here to finalize my hostile takeover of it." The silence that followed my declaration shattered the moment Preston slammed his massive fist onto the mahogany table. The impact rattled the crystal wine glasses, sloshing expensive red burgundy onto the pristine white tablecloth. His chair screeched violently against the hardwood floor as he stood up, his face flushed with an ugly, mottled rage. He could not fathom what was happening. To Preston, I was just his wife's pathetic, socially unfit sister. I was the dark-skinned woman he casually handed his coat to at family Thanksgiving dinners, the scapegoat he openly mocked to bond with my father. The idea that I was the architect of his destruction broke his fragile reality. "You are a liar!" Preston shouted, jabbing a thick finger in my direction. His voice cracked with panic as he looked around at the board members, desperately trying to wrangle their attention back to his fading authority. "Do not listen to a single word she says. These documents are fabricated. This is a sick, jealous stunt. She is a fraud who cannot accept that she threw her life away." He stepped away from his seat and marched toward my end of the table, using his tall, broad frame to physically intimidate me. He loomed over my chair, invading my personal space, his breathing heavy and erratic. In the past, this exact physical aggression would have sent my mother into a flurry of apologies on my behalf, while my father would have nodded in silent approval at Preston putting me in my place. From the corner of my eye, I saw two of Elias Thorne's private security details shift their weight, their hands moving discreetly toward their earpieces. They were ready to intercept Preston the moment he crossed a physical line. I raised my hand just an inch, a silent command for them to stand down. I did not need protection from Preston. I wanted to handle him myself. I did not flinch. I did not lean away. I looked up at his sweating, panicked face with complete indifference. Fabricated, I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue slowly. That is a fascinating choice of words, Preston, especially coming from a man whose entire career is a fabrication built on stolen property. Preston scoffed loudly, but I saw his eyes dart nervously toward Elias, who was standing beside me with his arms crossed, watching the implosion with quiet amusement. "You are insane," Preston sneered, though he took a half-step back. "I am the vice president of this firm. I earned my position by generating record profits. You have nothing to do with my success." I stood up slowly, ensuring that my movements were fluid and deliberate. I smoothed the front of my simple black dress, the same dress he had mocked just minutes earlier. Then I turned my attention away from him and directly addressed the board members who were still frantically reading through the Aegis Capital portfolios. 10 years ago, I began my voice clear and projecting to every corner of the private dining room. I was 25 years old, working out of a cramped library building predictive financial algorithms. I developed a risk assessment model designed to identify emerging undervalued markets. It was brilliant, and it was entirely my own intellectual property. I brought my laptop to a family dinner right here in the city, hoping to show my father the prototype. I stepped away to take a phone call. When I returned, the files had been copied onto an external drive. Preston's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but no sound came out. 3 months later, I continued keeping my eyes locked on the senior board members. Preston presented a miraculous new trading algorithm to this very board. My father hailed him as a financial prodigy. You promoted him to director, handed him millions in client portfolios, and treated him like the savior of your legacy. You never once questioned how a man who barely scraped by in his collegiate finance courses suddenly authored a piece of highly complex proprietary code. "That is a complete lie," Preston shouted, his voice shrill. He looked frantically at my father. "Reginald, tell them she is lying. Tell them I built those models." My father did not look up. Reginald sat paralyzed, his trembling hands gripping the edges of the portfolio I had given him. He was reading the forensic data, seeing the irrefutable truth in black and white. I turned my gaze back to Preston, stepping out from behind my chair, so there was nothing between us. "I knew you stole it that very night, Preston. You always left a trail of sloppy mistakes because you never believed anyone would hold you accountable. But here's the part you never realized. I knew you were snooping through my work long before that dinner. I knew you were looking for a shortcut to impress my father. So I deliberately left a massive, gaping blind spot in the code you stole." A collective gasp rippled through the room. One of the older board members, a man who had invested heavily in Preston's division, dropped his reading glasses onto his plate. "I called it the Icarus sequence," I said, smiling coldly at my brother-in-law. "The algorithm was fundamentally flawed. I designed it to aggressively inflate short-term gains while completely ignoring the accumulation of long-term toxic debt. It was built to fly high for exactly 8 years before the foundational math collapsed in on itself. I engineered it to fail, Preston. I built the trap, I set it on my laptop, and you eagerly walked right into it like the greedy, untalented thief you are." Preston took another step back, bumping into a serving cart. The silver cutlery rattled loudly against the porcelain plates. "And now," I said, taking a step toward him, forcing him to retreat further. "The Icarus sequence has run its course. For the past 2 years, your division has been hemorrhaging capital. You have been desperately moving client money around, trying to plug the holes of a sinking ship, hiding behind fabricated quarterly reports. That stolen algorithm is the foundation of your entire career, and it is the exact reason this legacy firm is currently facing insolvency. The board members erupted into chaotic whispers. They were flipping furiously to the back of the portfolios, finding the exact financial projections and the corresponding losses I had just described. The math was undeniably perfect. The proof was absolute. The firm they had trusted was rotting from the inside out, and the man responsible was standing in front of them, sweating through his expensive tailored suit. Preston looked like a trapped animal. He looked at his wife Jasmine, who was sitting with her mouth open, staring at him in sheer horror. He looked at my mother, who was pressing her napkin to her face, unable to comprehend the disaster unfolding around her. He had lost control of the narrative, and he had absolutely no idea how to survive on his own merits. "This is corporate espionage!" Preston yelled, his voice echoing frantically off the walls. He pointed a trembling finger at Elias Thorne. "Elias, you cannot partner with her. She is a criminal. She admitted to sabotage. I demand that you call the police right now. Have restaurant security throw her out. Have her arrested for trespassing and fraud. Call the cops." I leaned back slightly, adjusting my posture with effortless grace. I looked at Preston, watching him completely unravel. I did not raise my voice, but the chilling authority in my tone made the entire room fall dead silent. "Please call them, Preston. But make sure you bring the SEC with them. Let us talk about your offshore accounts in the Caymans." The silence following my mention of the Securities and Exchange Commission was absolute. Preston collapsed backward into his dining chair, the heavy thud echoing across the private room. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence drained from his features, leaving behind nothing but the pale, sweating face of a man who realized his corporate execution had just been televised to his own board of directors. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a ragged breath escaped. Jasmine stared at her husband. Her eyes darted from his trembling hands to the gold-embossed crest on the portfolio resting in front of him. I could see the exact second her reality fractured and reassembled itself. The golden child of our family did not possess loyalty. She possessed an unparalleled instinct for self-preservation. The staggering number Elias Thorne had just announced was finally settling into her status-obsessed brain. Her husband was a ruined, impending felon, but her sister was a billionaire. Jasmine stood up abruptly. She smoothed the front of her emerald silk gown, taking a deep breath to compose herself. The cruel sneer she had worn all evening vanished, replaced by a bright, brittle smile that looked completely grotesque given the circumstances. She walked around Preston as if he were a piece of broken furniture and moved toward my end of the table. "Grace," she said, her voice dripping with a sudden, sickening sweetness. "Let us take a breath. There is no need to let a silly corporate misunderstanding ruin a beautiful Christmas Eve. We are blood. We are sisters." The board members watched her in stunned fascination. Even Elias raised an eyebrow at the sheer audacity of her pivot. "I always knew you were going to do something incredible with those little computer programs of yours." Jasmine continued, waving her hand dismissively at the financial dossiers scattered across the table. "Preston has just been under so much pressure lately. You know how stressful it is to maintain our lifestyle. And honestly, your timing could not be more perfect. Heaven sent, really." She leaned her manicured hands on the table, leaning toward me like a conspirator sharing a secret. "Since you have had this massive windfall, you can help us clear up this tiny mess. You can cover the shortfall in Preston's accounts, and we can keep this entirely within the family. More importantly, you can take care of the Hamptons' property." I looked at her, my expression entirely unreadable. "The Hamptons' property," I repeated flatly. "Yes," she sighed dramatically, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "The mortgage on the summer house is $2 million in arrears. It has been an absolute nightmare trying to keep up appearances with the country club crowd while Preston mismanaged our funds. But a couple of million is pocket change to you now. You can wire the funds on Monday. Black excellence means we build generational wealth together, Grace. Family shares everything." The utter delusion in her voice was breathtaking. She genuinely believed her own narrative. She believed that the very same sister she had mocked, humiliated, and alienated for her entire adult life was simply a walking ATM waiting to fund her high society charade. I picked up my water glass, taking a slow sip before setting it down gently on the pristine white tablecloth. Family shares everything, I asked, my voice calm, smooth, and laced with absolute venom. That is a fascinating philosophy, Jasmine. Did family share everything when you planned your extravagant baby shower at the Plaza Hotel and explicitly uninvited me? Because as you told Mother, my natural hair and simple wardrobe were too militant for your curated aesthetic. You hired a string quartet, but you could not spare a single seat for your own sister because I did not fit the visual brand you were selling to your wealthy friends. Jasmine blinked, her fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Grace, that was years ago. I was stressed about the pregnancy. Did family share everything when you got married? I continued, my voice rising slightly, cutting through her pathetic excuse. You demanded I buy a $5,000 bridesmaid dress while I was drowning in student debt and building my company. When I told you I could not afford it, you did not offer to help. You told Preston's wealthy white family that I was a distant cousin from a broken home just so they would not realize your actual sister was sleeping on a mattress in Queens. You made me stand in the service hallway during your reception because I was not socially fit to mingle with the elites. Her face flushed a deep, angry crimson. The board members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, witnessing the ugly, toxic underbelly of the family my father so proudly paraded around New York. I do not fund leeches, Jasmine, I said, leaning forward. I built an empire to empower people who actually work for their survival. I did not build a billion-dollar fortune to subsidize the lifestyle of a spoiled, entitled woman who cares more about the label on her handbag than the blood in her veins. You will not see a single dime of my money. You are completely on your own. The rejection hit her like a physical blow. The sweet, manipulative facade shattered instantly, revealing the vicious, spoiled child underneath. Jasmine slammed her hands down on the table, her perfectly manicured nails clicking sharply against the wood. You selfish, bitter loser, she screamed, all pretense of high society elegance entirely gone. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the expensive chandeliers above us. I had to protect my brand. You were an absolute embarrassment to this family. You never cared about our image. You never cared about how hard I worked to secure our position in this city. You owe me this money. You owe this family. I sat perfectly still, letting her rage wash over me without absorbing a single drop of it. I owe you nothing, I replied coldly. You built a life entirely on debt theft and optics, and now the bill is due. Jasmine gripped the edge of the table, her chest heaving as she hyperventilated. The reality of her impending social execution was tearing her apart. You do not understand, she shrieked, tears of pure panic finally spilling down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. The summer house is everything. It is where we host the charity gala. It is our anchor. You cannot let them take it. The bank sent the final notice on Thursday. They are foreclosing on the house on Monday morning. I will be publicly humiliated. I will be homeless in front of everyone who matters. They are going to lock the gates and take the property on Monday. I looked at her tear-streaked face at the sheer terror of a woman losing the only thing that gave her empty life meaning. I allowed a slow, chilling smile to spread across my face. I know, Jasmine, I said softly, my words falling like heavy stones in the silent room. Because yesterday my holding company bought the bank that owns your debt. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the thick carpet, and collapsed into her chair. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land, but no sound came out. The sheer magnitude of my statement paralyzed her. The bank was mine. Her debt was mine. Her precious social standing was resting entirely in the palm of my hand, and she knew I had absolutely no reason to close my fingers and hold on. The board members exchanged terrified glances. They were trapped in a room witnessing the systematic dismantling of the Wilson family dynasty. Elias Thorne stood silently by my side, a towering monument of validation that made every word I spoke an undeniable fact. Seeing her golden child reduced to a trembling, speechless mess, my mother decided it was time to intervene. Vivian had always been the ultimate enabler, the grand architect of our family's toxic dynamics. When brute force failed, she relied on her specialty: emotional warfare. Vivian stood up slowly. She smoothed her silk dress, took a deep, shuddering breath, and painted a look of profound, wounded maternal love across her face. She walked toward me, her arms slightly outstretched, her eyes shimmering with manufactured tears. The transition was so flawless, it was almost worthy of an Academy Award. "Grace, my sweet girl," Vivian murmured, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical vulnerability. "This has gone far enough. Look at what you are doing to your sister. Look at what you are doing to your father. We are a family. We share the same blood. You are letting anger cloud your judgment, and it is tearing us apart." I did not step back. I let her approach, watching the desperate calculation in her eyes. "You have achieved something magnificent," Vivian continued, stopping just a few feet away from me. "You are a billionaire. You have secured the bag. But you must remember where you came from. We are a prominent Black family in a world that wants to see us fail. We owe it to our ancestors, to the people who fought for us, to be in rooms like this, to keep our generational wealth intact and united. You cannot let petty childhood grievances destroy the empire your father built, or the home your sister loves." She reached out, attempting to place her manicured hand over mine. I smoothly pulled my hand away, leaving her grasping at empty air. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice dangerously low. Vivian pulled her hand back to her chest, looking as though I had physically struck her. "Grace, please," she pleaded, turning to make sure the board members were watching her play the victim. "We were hard on you, yes. We demanded excellence. But look at the result. Look at the woman standing before us today. If we had not pushed you, if we had not demanded greatness, you never would have built Aegis Capital. We gave you the grit you needed to succeed. We were just practicing tough love. You owe your drive to us." The sheer audacity of her gaslighting sent a jolt of cold, focused energy straight down my spine. She was actually trying to take credit for the resilience I had forged entirely out of the trauma she inflicted. "Tough love," I repeated, turning the words over in my mouth like a bitter poison. "You think your cruelty was an investment in my future? You think stripping me of my dignity was a masterclass in building grit? Let us talk about your unique brand of maternal love, Vivian. Let us talk about my junior year of college." My mother's eyes widened, the fake warmth instantly evaporating. The mention of my junior year caused a visible tremor to run through her perfectly postured frame. "Grace, this is not the time," Vivian hissed, dropping the sweet act for a fraction of a second. "It is exactly the time," I stated, turning my body so the entire room could hear the absolute truth. "Gentlemen, my mother loves to talk about supporting Black excellence and honoring our ancestors. But let me tell you how she funded my sister's aesthetic. When I was 20 years old, I went to the registrar's office to pay my university tuition. I had a custodial college fund, a joint account my grandmother had set up for me before she passed away. There was exactly $60,000 in that account, meant to ensure I graduated debt-free. I took a step closer to my mother, forcing her to look me in the eye. When the teller pulled up my financial records, the account was empty. Every single dollar had been withdrawn 3 days prior. I called the bank in a panic, thinking my identity had been stolen. And you know what the bank manager told me? He told me the secondary signatory on the account had initiated a wire transfer. My mother looked at the floor, unable to maintain eye contact. The board members were completely silent, hanging on to every single word. "You drained my college fund, Vivian," I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "You stole $60,000 from your own daughter's education. And do you want to tell this room what you bought with my future? Do you want to tell them, or should I?" Vivian opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She wrung her hands together, the diamonds on her fingers flashing in the ambient light. "She bought a destination wedding," I announced to the room, pointing directly at Jasmine, who was currently staring at her plate in humiliated silence. My sister demanded a lavish Instagram-perfect wedding in Lake Como, Italy. My father refused to liquidate his firm's assets to pay for it, so my mother quietly liquidated my education. She bought first-class plane tickets, imported floral arrangements, and a custom designer gown using the money my grandmother left for my degree. I turned back to my mother, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. You left me stranded. The university dropped my enrollment. I was forced to pack my belongings into garbage bags because I could not even afford boxes. While you and Jasmine were drinking vintage champagne on a private terrace overlooking the Italian coast, I was moving into a 200-square-foot studio apartment in Queens. It was infested with roaches. The radiator was broken. I spent that entire winter wearing a heavy wool coat inside my own apartment, writing the foundational code for Aegis Capital with freezing fingers because I could not afford to turn on the space heater. Vivian burst into tears, but this time the panic was real. "Grace, I had to," she sobbed, throwing her hands up defensively. "Your sister had a vision. She was marrying Preston. The Blackwoods expected a certain caliber of event. You were just studying computer science. I thought you could take out a loan. I thought you would figure it out. I had to give your sister the wedding she deserved." "You sacrificed my survival to fund her vanity," I corrected her sharply. "You did not push me to be great. You pushed me into poverty and I climbed out of it entirely in spite of you. I do not owe this family my wealth. I do not owe our ancestors your continued financial comfort. My only duty is to the truth, and the truth is that you are thieves dressed in designer clothing." Reginald had heard enough. Seeing his wife publicly dismantled and his golden child rendered mute, his fragile patriarchal pride overrode whatever business sense he had left. He pushed his chair back violently and marched to the center of the room, standing between me and my mother. "That is enough." Reginald bellowed, his face dark red with fury. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical size to command the authority he had already lost. "You can stand there and drag your mother's name through the mud all you want. You can flaunt your tech money and brag about buying a bank. But you are forgetting one crucial detail about my firm, Grace." He pointed a stiff finger at my chest. "I built this brokerage from nothing. Aegis Capital might have executed a hostile takeover on paper. You might hold the majority voting shares, but a firm is nothing without its leadership. My top executives, my senior partners, the men who actually run the daily operations of this company, they are fiercely loyal to me. We have bled together for 20 years. If you try to walk into my building and take the helm, they will resign en masse." Reginald crossed his arms, a smug, triumphant smile returning to his face. "They will walk out the door and they will take every major client portfolio with them. You will inherit an empty shell, Grace. You have money, but you do not have my men. They will never answer to a disrespectful, ungrateful girl who thinks she can buy respect. You cannot touch my legacy." I did not blink. I did not break eye contact with my father. I slowly reached into my black designer clutch and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated the dim space between us. "You think your executives are loyal to you, Reginald?" I asked softly, my thumb hovering over the screen. "You think men who worship money are going to sink with your obsolete ship when a trillion-dollar tech firm offers them a lifeboat?" I unlocked the phone and tapped the screen twice. "Let us ask them right now." The sharp, rhythmic ringing of my phone echoed through the cavernous private dining room, slicing through the thick, suffocating silence. I had placed the device flat in the absolute center of the mahogany table, activating the speakerphone. The screen cast a harsh, artificial glow upward, illuminating the terrified faces of the wealthy board members gathered around it. Outside, the Manhattan blizzard raged against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside the temperature felt as though it had dropped below freezing. Ring 1. My father, Reginald, stood tall, puffing out his chest in a desperate attempt to project the authority he felt slipping through his fingers. He adjusted the lapels of his custom Italian suit, a nervous habit I had watched him perform 1,000 times before firing a subordinate or intimidating a rival. He shot a smug conspiratorial glance at his board of directors, silently assuring them that he was still the patriarch, still the untouchable titan of Wall Street. Ring 2. My mother. Vivian sat entirely motionless, her diamond-draped hands trembling in her lap. The picture-perfect facade of high society black excellence she had curated for decades was crumbling before her very eyes, and she lacked the psychological tools to stop it. Preston was physically sweating, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as he stared at the phone. He knew exactly what a chief financial officer could uncover if given the right access to his meticulously hidden offshore accounts. Ring 3. The line clicked open. The crisp, familiar voice of Marcus Vance, the chief financial officer of my father's legacy firm, filled the quiet room. Marcus Vance, speaking, the voice announced sharp and professional. Reginald did not even give me a fraction of a second to speak. He immediately lunged forward, leaning over the table toward the device, his voice booming with the aggressive, domineering cadence he reserved for his employees. "Marcus, it is Reginald," my father barked, projecting a false, hearty confidence that strained the edges of his vocal cords. "Listen to me very carefully. My delusional daughter has somehow gotten her hands on your personal number, and she is attempting to stage some sort of pathetic holiday theatrical stunt. Hang up the phone immediately. We are in the middle of a private board dinner with Elias Thorne, and I will not have my senior staff dragged into her ridiculous little tantrums. Do not humor her. Hang up right now, and I will see you in the office on Monday morning." My father stood up straight, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He looked down at me with a victorious sneer, fully expecting the dial tone to sound. He fully expected Marcus, a man who had worked beneath him for over 2 decades, to instantly obey the command of his master. In Reginald's world, loyalty was a commodity purchased with generous end-of-year bonuses and exclusive country club memberships. He fundamentally believed he owned the men who worked for him. The dial tone did not sound. Instead, an agonizing heavy silence stretched across the speakerphone. I did not move a single muscle. I sat back in my chair, my hands resting lightly in my lap, waiting for the execution to proceed exactly as I had orchestrated it. "Marcus," my father snapped, his false confidence beginning to waver, replaced by a sharp edge of genuine panic. "Did you hear my direct order? I am your chief executive officer. Hang up the damn phone before I terminate your contract and strip you of your stock options." The speakerphone crackled softly. Marcus Vance completely bypassed my father. He did not acknowledge Reginald's threats. He did not acknowledge Reginald's existence. When Marcus spoke, his voice was entirely stripped of the deferential tone he had used with my father for 20 years. It was replaced with the absolute unwavering respect reserved only for a commanding superior. "Ms. Grace," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the dining room like a surgical blade, "have the voting shares been transferred to your name yet?" The impact of those words hit the room with the force of a physical explosion. Reginald stumbled backward as if he had been shot. His expensive leather shoes slipped against the polished hardwood floor, and he collapsed heavily into his dining chair. The heavy oak frame groaned under his dead weight. The deep, rich color drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw went completely slack. The untouchable titan of Wall Street was suddenly gone, replaced by a broken, terrified old man staring into the abyss of his own ruin. The senior board members, men who had previously hung on my father's every word, practically shrank away from him. They looked at the glowing phone on the table as if it were a live grenade. They understood the terrifying reality of what Marcus was asking. The chief financial officer was verifying the chain of command. He was publicly pledging his allegiance to the new owner of the firm. "Yes, Marcus," I replied smoothly, my voice calm and devoid of the emotional hysteria my family so desperately wanted to provoke. The SEC filings cleared 10 minutes before the market closed. The 80% majority block is fully secured under Aegis Capital. You are officially working for me now. "Understood, Ms. Grace," Marcus replied without a moment of hesitation. "The transition protocols are fully prepped on my end. I have locked Reginald and Preston out of all executive trading accounts, and I have frozen the firm's offshore assets pending your final authorization. We are standing by for your directives." My father began to hyperventilate. His chest he heaved rapidly, his perfectly tailored suit jacket straining against his erratic breathing. He gripped the edges of the mahogany table so tightly that his knuckles turned a brilliant white. He was suffocating on the realization that his empire had been snatched from his hands without him even noticing. The loyalty he thought he had purchased had evaporated the moment a superior predator entered the ecosystem. Marcus Reginald gasped, his voice cracking, completely stripped of its usual booming authority. Marcus, what are you doing 20 years? I gave you 20 years of your career. I brought you into this firm when you were nothing but a junior analyst. I made you a wealthy man. We built this legacy together. How could you do this? How could you betray me for a dropout? How could you hand my company over to a little girl? Reginald was practically begging the speakerphone for a lifeline, desperate for a shred of the respect that had defined his entire existence. He needed to understand how the foundational rules of his world had been rewritten so ruthlessly. The silence that followed was surgical. I watched Elias Thorne observe the scene with quiet, calculating approval. He recognized the ruthless efficiency of my strategy. I had not just bought my father's company. I had dismantled the very psychological architecture he used to terrorize his family. Marcus's voice echoed through the speaker, utterly devoid of sympathy, warmth, or the decades of history my father had just invoked. Because she showed me the forensic audit, Reginald. You're ruined. Preston let out a strangled, pathetic sound from the other end of the table. He threw his hands over his face, realizing exactly what the forensic audit contained. He knew it detailed every single toxic trade, every falsified risk assessment, and every fraudulent offshore transfer he had executed using the flawed algorithms I had trapped him with a decade ago. The board members began frantically whispering among themselves, their faces pale with the realization that they were sitting on a financial powder keg. They were looking at my father not as a leader, but as a liability. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the dark wood of the table. I looked directly into my father's horrified, hyperventilating face. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. You demanded excellence, Reginald, I said, pronouncing his first name with sharp precision, permanently severing the familial title he had abused for 35 years. You told me that in this world the strong survive and the weak are liquidated. You told me I lacked the killer instinct required to build a legacy. You told me I was a failure because I refused to be a pawn in your outdated, crumbling aesthetic. I stood up slowly, my posture perfectly straight. I looked down at the man who had tossed $100 bill at me like a beggar. I took your advice. I continued, my voice ringing with undeniable power. I analyzed the market. I identified a failing, mismanaged asset run by incompetent leadership. I found a firm bleeding capital relying on fraudulent algorithms and masking its insolvency behind country club memberships and vintage wine. I saw a weakness. Reginald and I liquidated it. Your legacy does not belong to you anymore. It belongs to Aegis Capital. And as of this exact moment, you are formally terminated. The word terminated hung in the heavy perfumed air of the private dining room, like a physical blade suspended by a single thread. The line on the speakerphone went dead, leaving behind a profound, suffocating silence. The ambient noise of the Manhattan blizzard raging outside the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to amplify, rattling the thick glass. Inside, the temperature of the room felt as though it had plummeted into the freezing depths of winter. For several agonizing seconds, Reginald simply stared at the black rectangle of my smartphone resting in the exact center of the mahogany table. His brain, wired for absolute control and unyielding patriarchy, was violently misfiring, completely unable to process the magnitude of his defeat. He slowly dragged his gaze away from the phone and looked toward his board of directors. He was searching for a lifeline, searching for a single man willing to stand by his side and defend the crumbling ruins of his legacy. He found absolutely nothing. Arthur Sterling, the oldest and most influential investor on the board, quietly reached up and removed his reading glasses. He carefully folded them, placed them inside his tailored breast pocket, and picked up his linen napkin. He wiped the corners of his mouth with deliberate slowness. Then, without saying a single word to my father, Arthur stood up, pushed his chair in, and walked around the massive dining table. He did not leave the room. Instead, he walked directly to my side of the table and stood silently behind my right shoulder, aligning himself entirely with the new center of power. Within seconds, 2 more senior board members stood up and joined him, physically isolating my father at his end of the table. That visual defection was the final devastating blow. It completely shattered the last remaining fragment of my father's sanity. Reginald let out a raw, guttural roar that sounded more like a wounded animal than a Wall Street executive. He violently swept his arm across the table in a blind fit of rage. Crystal wine glasses, fine bone china plates, and silver cutlery went flying through the air, crashing against the oak-paneled walls and shattering across the hardwood floor. A bottle of vintage burgundy tipped over the dark red liquid, spilling across the pristine white tablecloth like a widening pool of fresh blood. Vivian shrieked, pressing her hands over her ears and shrinking back into her chair, terrified by the sudden violence. Jasmine sat frozen, her mouth open in a silent scream, as shards of crystal landed near her designer shoes. Preston had pushed his chair so far back, he was nearly pressed against the far wall, trying to make himself invisible. "I gave you life!" Reginald screamed, his voice cracking and echoing wildly in the confined space. He slammed both of his heavy fists down onto the table, leaning forward until his face was completely flushed with a dangerous mottled purple rage. The thick veins in his neck bulged, pulsing against the collar of his expensive Italian shirt. "You ungrateful, spiteful little viper," he roared, spit flying from his lips. "I put food in your mouth. I put a roof over your head. I allowed you to carry my name. You are nothing without my blood running through your veins. You are a traitor to your own family. You come into my space, you manipulate my employees, and you try to steal the empire I built with my bare hands. I am your father. You owe me absolute loyalty. You owe me your total submission." He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He was waiting for me to shrink. He was waiting for the psychological conditioning of my childhood to kick in, waiting for me to lower my eyes, apologize, and surrender to his booming, aggressive authority. He believed that his anger was the ultimate weapon, the one force I could never truly withstand. I did not flinch. I did not move a single inch. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching his spectacular meltdown with the detached clinical fascination of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. I let his furious echoes fade into the silence of the room. I let the board members watch him unravel. Then I slowly stood up. I did not rush. I smoothed the front of my elegant black dress and stepped away from my chair, walking slowly around the edge of the table until I was standing just a few feet away from him, separated only by the ruined wine-stained tablecloth. "Blood loyalty. Reginald," I asked, my voice dangerously quiet, yet carrying so much icy authority that the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "You want to stand here in front of these men and preach about the sacred bonds of family. You want to talk about the unconditional support of a father. Let us examine your definition of fatherhood." I took another step closer, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. His rage was hot and erratic, but mine was cold, focused, and completely absolute. "Let us go back exactly 10 years, I said, keeping my gaze locked onto his. I was 25 years old. I was living in that roach-infested studio in Queens because Mother had drained my college accounts to fund Jasmine's destination wedding. I was working over 100 hours a week, coding the foundational architecture for my very first financial application. I was eating ramen noodles once a day. I was running on 4 hours of sleep a week. And on a freezing Tuesday morning in November, my body completely gave out. Reginald's jaw twitched. A flicker of recognition crossed his eyes, followed immediately by a flash of profound discomfort. I collapsed on the subway platform. I continued, my voice steady, projecting the story clearly, so the board members could hear every single miserable detail. I woke up 24 hours later in the emergency ward of a public hospital. The fluorescent lights were blinding. The room smelled like bleach and sickness. I had an intravenous line taped to my arm, pumping fluids into my severely malnourished, dehydrated body. I had no health insurance because I was putting every penny I earned into server hosting fees. The hospital billing department required an immediate $5,000 payment to cover the emergency admission, the blood panels, and the mandatory observation period. I watched Vivian lower her head, refusing to look at me. Jasmine stared blankly at the wall, completely devoid of empathy. The head nurse looked at my emergency contact form. I said, my voice hardening into steel. She called you Reginald. She told you your daughter had collapsed from sheer exhaustion and needed a brief medical hold. I remember lying in that cold, stiff hospital bed, terrified, weak, and praying that just this once, my father would show up for me. And you did show up. Reginald swallowed hard. The furious red color was slowly draining from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and cornered. You walked into that emergency ward wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my entire medical bill, I recounted, letting the memory paint the room. You did not come into my room. You did not ask a single nurse how I was doing. You did not ask if I was going to be okay. I dragged myself out of that bed, pulling my heavy intravenous pole down the hallway just to see you. I stood behind a dividing wall, and I listened to you speak to the hospital billing administrator. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the tension to build until it was almost unbearable. I wanted him to feel the exact weight of his own cruelty. The administrator handed you the invoice for $5,000. I said, my tone completely merciless. $5,000. A sum you spend on a single round of golf at your country club. A sum you tip the maitre d' at this very restaurant to secure your favorite table. You looked at that piece of paper, Reginald. You looked at the bill for your daughter's physical survival, and you handed it back to the administrator. I took a final step forward, leaning over the table, closing the distance between us, until I could see the sweat rolling down his temples. Do you want to know what you told her, Reginald? I asked, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that easily carried to the silent board members standing behind me. You told her I am not paying a single cent for a failed experiment. You told her to send the bill to a collection agency because your daughter was a bad investment. A collective gasp echoed from the corner of the room where the board members were standing. Arthur Sterling slowly shook his head in disgust. Even Elias Thorne, a man who had witnessed the most ruthless corporate betrayals in the world, tightened his jaw in sheer contempt. You turned around and walked out of those sliding glass doors, leaving me to face a collection agency while my body was failing. I stated, standing up to my full height. You left me there to rot because you determined that my life yielded no viable financial return. You calculated my worth on a balance sheet, and you decided I was bankrupt. Reginald opened his mouth desperately, searching for a justification, an excuse, a way to spin his horrific behavior into some twisted lesson about resilience. I was trying to teach you. He stammered, his voice weak and trembling. I was trying to show you the real world. I cut him off immediately. You showed me exactly who you are, and it was the greatest gift you ever gave me. Because lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling with a collection notice in my lap, I completely eradicated you from my heart. I stopped seeking your approval. I stopped wanting your love. I stopped being your daughter. I became a machine. I paid off that medical debt by writing flawless, predatory code for your biggest competitors. I used the rage you gave me to build Aegis Capital. I used your absolute lack of humanity as the blueprint for my entire empire. I looked at my father with dead, empty eyes. There was no anger left in me. There was no sadness. There was only the cold, sterile reality of a completed transaction. You were right, Dad, I said smoothly, my voice echoing with absolute finality. I was a bad investment for you, but I am an incredible auditor. Before Reginald could even process the absolute destruction of his patriarchal authority, Elias Thorne stepped forward from the shadows. His heavy leather shoes made no sound on the carpet, but his presence commanded the entire room. He moved to the very center of the ruined dining table, bypassing the spilled wine and the shattered glass. With a swift, powerful motion, Elias dropped a massive leather-bound financial dossier squarely onto the table. The heavy thud of the documents hitting the wood sounded exactly like a judge's gavel striking a sound block. The heavy thud of the leather-bound financial dossier striking the center of the mahogany dining table sounded like a vault door slamming shut. The crystal glasses that had survived my father's earlier rampage vibrated against the wood. Elias Thorne slowly pulled his hand back from the massive document, his expression a mask of pure, unadulterated judgment. He took one deliberate step backward, melting into the periphery of the room, silently transferring absolute control of the execution back to me. I looked at the dossier. The gold foil lettering on the cover caught the dim light of the chandeliers. It was a forensic masterpiece, compiled by a team of 50 merciless accountants who had spent the last 72 hours tearing apart the digital skeleton of my father's legacy firm. I reached out and rested my fingertips against the cool leather cover. I locked eyes with Preston. He was pressed so hard against the back of his chair that the wood was audibly groaning under the strain of his weight. His face, usually a mask of smug, unearned entitlement, had completely collapsed. I pushed the dossier. It slid across the polished mahogany, the heavy binding scraping softly against the wood, parting a sea of spilled red wine and shattered glass. It came to a stop exactly 1 inch from Preston's white dinner plate. Preston stared down at the document as if it were a venomous snake coiled and ready to strike. He did not reach for it. He did not even breathe. The color drained from his face so rapidly that his skin took on a sickening translucent gray pallor. A single bead of sweat broke loose from his hairline and rolled down his temple, tracing a shiny path through the expensive cologne he had splashed on hours earlier. "Open it, Preston," I commanded, my voice slicing through the suffocating silence of the room. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. His hands remained glued to the armrests of his chair. He was paralyzed by the absolute certainty of his own destruction. "Since you are suddenly struggling with reading comprehension, I will walk you through the highlights," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. I did not need to open a copy. I had memorized every single digit, every fraudulent transaction, every pathetic attempt to hide his tracks. "Let us turn our attention to the firm's elite client trust accounts," I announced, projecting my voice so every single senior board member could hear the precise details of their impending ruin. Specifically, the dormant generational trusts. The accounts held by elderly widows and overseas heirs who only review their statements once a fiscal year. Arthur Sterling, the senior board member standing behind me, inhaled sharply. I heard the rustle of paper as he and the other executives frantically flipped open their own copies of the portfolios I had provided earlier. For the past 36 months, I continued my tone-flat, clinical, and completely devoid of mercy. "You have been systematically bleeding those accounts dry. You did not take large, noticeable sums. You were a coward, Preston. You siphoned microfractions of a percentage point from hundreds of individual portfolios, diverting the capital into a cascading series of shell companies before the funds ultimately landed in 3 offshore accounts registered in the Cayman Islands." "That is not true." Preston rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "You cannot prove any of this. It is a lie." I ignored his pathetic whimpering and raised my voice just enough to drown him out. $34,822,416, I stated, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "That is the exact dollar amount missing from your elite clients. That is the exact amount you stole while sitting in this very boardroom, drinking my father's vintage wine, and calling me a failure." My father let out a strangled, breathless choke. Reginald looked at Preston, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. The hostility and rage that had consumed my father only moments ago vanished instantly, replaced by the terrifying understanding of his own legal liability. As the chief executive officer, Reginald was legally responsible for the fiduciary security of his clients. Preston had not just stolen money, he had built a guillotine directly over my father's neck. Preston was shaking violently now. He opened his mouth, desperately searching for a lie, an excuse, a scapegoat. I did not give him the oxygen to form a single word. "You thought you were a genius, didn't you, Preston?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You thought you had orchestrated the perfect, undetectable crime. But you are not a genius. You are just a parasite who got lucky 10 years ago when you stole my code." I stood up, walking slowly around the edge of the table, closing the distance between us. Preston shrank back in his chair as I approached. When you stole the Icarus sequence from my laptop, you realized there was a massive blind spot in the algorithm's risk assessment matrix, I explained, watching the sheer terror bloom in his eyes. You saw that the code deliberately ignored the accumulation of long-term toxic debt. You thought that was a flaw you could exploit. You used that exact blind spot to mask your embezzlement. You buried $34 million in stolen capital inside the dark corners of my algorithm, confident that no regulatory audit could ever untangle the math. I stopped right next to his chair, leaning down so my face was inches from his sweating, panicked features. "But you forgot the most fundamental rule of theft, Preston," I whispered, my voice dripping with cold, predatory satisfaction. "You cannot hide your tracks in a house you did not build. I wrote that code. I engineered that blind spot. I knew every single shadow in that algorithm because I painted them there. When my forensic accountants breached your servers, they did not have to search for your missing millions. I gave them the exact mathematical coordinates. I handed them the map to your prison cell." The dining room descended into absolute pandemonium. Arthur Sterling slammed his portfolio shut and pointed a trembling finger directly at my father. Reginald Arthur roared, his voice thick with panic and outrage. "Do you understand what your son-in-law has done? The Securities and Exchange Commission will dismantle this firm by Tuesday. They will seize our personal assets. We are facing federal prison because you handed the keys of this company to a criminal." Reginald could not speak. He sat frozen in his chair, clutching his chest, his mouth opening and closing silently as he stared at the monster he had empowered. Suddenly, Jasmine leapt out of her chair. The sound of her heels striking the floor was sharp and aggressive. She inserted herself between me and Preston, throwing her arms out defensively as if she were shielding him from a physical attack. Her face was flushed, her eyes wild with the frantic, delusional entitlement that had defined her entire life. "Shut up," Jasmine screamed, pointing a vicious, trembling finger at Arthur Sterling before turning her wrath entirely on me. "All of you just shut up." She glared at me, her chest heaving, completely unable to process the reality of the mathematical evidence sitting on the table. "You are a liar!" Grace Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. "Preston is a genius. He is a financial prodigy. Dad said so himself. Preston worked 80 hours a week to keep this pathetic firm afloat while everyone else was failing. He brought in the biggest whales. He secured the most exclusive accounts. He is the only reason this family has maintained any level of prestige in this city. You are just trying to destroy him because no man has ever looked at you the way Preston looks at me. You are a bitter, lonely billionaire trying to tear down a successful marriage." I looked at my sister. I looked at the extravagant diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, the custom silk gown, the flawless, expensive veneer she had draped over a foundation of absolute rot. She was desperately clinging to the illusion of her superiority, terrified of the impending freefall. I shook my head slowly, a cold, empty smile touching the corners of my mouth. "He did not keep this firm afloat, Jasmine," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical screaming with effortless, devastating calm. "He sank it to buy you your Bentley. He sank it to fund your $500,000 country club memberships, your first-class flights to Paris, and your endless, pathetic need to prove you were better than everyone else." Jasmine crossed her arms, her chin jutting out defiantly. She refused to break character. "You cannot prove anything." She spat, her voice trembling with manufactured bravado. "Preston manages his own accounts. I am his wife. I have nothing to do with his corporate ledgers. You are just trying to scare me." I let out a short, dark laugh that caused Preston to flinch violently in his seat. I reached past Jasmine, tapped the cover of the forensic dossier resting in front of her husband, and looked her dead in the eyes. "And the best part?" I whispered, my voice dripping with absolute venom. "Your signature is on the wire transfers." The blood drained from Jasmine's face so rapidly I thought she might actually lose consciousness. She stood frozen over the ruined dining table, her manicured finger still pointing in my direction, but the fierce, arrogant fire in her eyes had been completely extinguished. It was replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a woman who had just realized she was standing on a trapdoor and I was holding the lever. "I do not know what you are talking about," Jasmine whispered, her voice trembling, dropping the shrill hysteria for a tone of genuine, unadulterated panic. "I never signed any wire transfers. I do not handle the finances." Preston handles all the accounts. I looked down at the massive leather-bound dossier Elias had dropped onto the table. I did not even need to open it. I had memorized the architecture of their fraud down to the very last decimal point. You do not handle the corporate finances, Jasmine? I agreed smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly calm against her rising terror. But you do handle your personal brand. You handle the charity galas, the interior design renovations, and the extravagant social events that keep you on the front page of the society columns. Do the names Platinum Event Design and Crestview Philanthropic ring a bell? Jasmine flinched as if I had struck her across the face. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I will take your silence as a yes. I continued pacing slowly behind my chair, commanding the attention of every board member in the room. Platinum Event Design and Crestview Philanthropic are ghost companies. They are shell corporations registered in Delaware with 0 employees, 0 actual services, and 0 legitimate revenue. They exist solely on paper. Over the past 3 years, Preston authorized $34 million in payments to those 2 entities, categorizing them as corporate event expenses and charitable donations from the firm's elite client trust accounts. I stopped pacing and locked eyes with my sister. And you, Jasmine, as the designated chairperson of those fictitious charities and the sole proprietor of that design firm, signed every single authorization form to release those funds into your personal offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. You did not just spend the stolen money, you actively facilitated the laundering process. The federal government calls that conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Jasmine slowly turned her head to look at her husband. The pristine, curated image of the golden couple, the envy of New York high society, shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of the board of directors. Preston, she breathed, her voice cracking. What did you make me sign? You told me those were tax write-offs. You told me it was standard corporate restructuring to fund the foundation. Preston had shrunk so far back into his chair he looked like a cornered rat. The polished, charismatic executive facade was entirely gone. He was sweating profusely. His tie loosened, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors. When his wife turned on him, demanding an answer in front of the men who were about to hand him over to the federal authorities, something inside Preston snapped. The sheer pressure of his impending ruin broke his conditioning, and he lashed out with the viciousness of a drowning man pulling someone else under. Do not stand there and play the innocent victim, Preston roared, leaping out of his chair so violently it crashed backward onto the floor. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Jasmine's face. You knew exactly what we were doing. You knew my salary could not cover your insane, psychotic spending habits. Jasmine physically recoiled, stepping back so quickly she nearly tripped over the edge of the carpet. You are a liar, she shrieked, her hands flying to her diamond necklace as if she were suffocating. You promised me a lifestyle. You told my father you could provide for me. Provide for you. Preston laughed, a manic, breathless sound that echoed terribly in the private dining room. Providing for you is impossible, Jasmine. You bleed money like it is oxygen. You demanded a $200,000 kitchen remodel in a Hamptons house we only visit 3 weeks a year. You spent $80,000 chartering private jets to St. Bart's because you refused to fly commercial with the peasants. You threw a baby shower at the Plaza Hotel that cost more than most people make in a decade. He took a step toward her, his face twisted in absolute disgust, airing the toxic, rotting core of their marriage for the entire board of directors to witness. My father, Reginald, watched in silent horror as his hand-picked successor publicly humiliated his favorite daughter. I was drowning, Preston screamed, completely ignoring the stunned executives watching him confess to his motives. The firm was losing clients. The market was shifting. My legitimate commissions were drying up. But you did not care. You never cared. Whenever I told you we needed to cut back, you threw a tantrum. You threatened to leave me. You threatened to go crying to your father and tell him I was a failure. You told me I was nothing compared to the men you could have married. Jasmine's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. She abandoned her victim routine instantly, her features hardening into a mask of pure venom. She stepped right back into his personal space, jabbing her manicured finger into his chest. "Because you are a failure, Preston." She spat, her voice dripping with sheer contempt. "You are a weak, pathetic excuse for a man. You were a mid-level nobody before my father hired you. You were a charity case. We elevated you. We gave you the Blackwell name. It was your job to maintain the standard I require. If you were not smart enough to make the money legally, that is your incompetence, not my problem." The utter depravity of her statement hung in the air. She was not angry that he had stolen millions of dollars from innocent people. She was angry that he had been caught. She was angry that his incompetence was going to cost her the Bentley and the country club memberships. Preston stared at his wife, his chest heaving. The realization that she was entirely willing to throw him to the wolves to save her own skin finally cemented itself in his mind. He looked around the room. He looked at Arthur Sterling, who was staring at him with undisguised revulsion. He looked at Reginald, who was hyperventilating in his chair, completely paralyzed by the destruction of his family's reputation. He looked at Elias Thorne, who stood silently in the background, a towering monument of impending legal action. Preston stopped yelling. A sudden terrifying clarity washed over his sweating face. He realized that staying in this room fighting with his wife and trying to justify his actions to a board of directors who now viewed him as radioactive waste was completely pointless. He was going to federal prison. The Securities and Exchange Commission would seize the firm by Monday morning. The FBI would raid his offices. He had absolutely no future in New York. But he still had the offshore accounts. He still had the encrypted digital wallets where he had funneled the last remaining millions of the stolen client funds. If he could just secure the untraceable cryptocurrency, if he could just initiate the final transfer protocols, he could disappear. He could walk out the service elevator of this restaurant, get a car to Teterboro Airport, and be on a private flight to a non-extradition country before the banks even opened on Monday. Preston abruptly turned his back on Jasmine. He ignored her continued shrieking. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. His hands were shaking violently, but his thumbs moved with desperate practiced speed across the screen. "What are you doing?" Jasmine demanded, grabbing his arm. "Do not walk away from me. We are not finished." "Get your hands off me!" Preston hissed violently, shaking her off without looking up from his phone. "I am done with you. I am done with your father. I am leaving." He took several rapid steps toward the heavy double doors of the dining room, his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his device as he frantically attempted to bypass the security protocols on his offshore banking application. He was entirely focused on accessing the digital ledger, desperate to initiate the routing sequence that would scatter the remaining stolen millions across a dozen anonymous crypto wallets. "You are not calling your lawyer Preston," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic noise of the room. I watched him freeze mid-step, his shoulders tensing. "You are not calling a taxi. You are attempting to access the Cayman Islands server. You are trying to initiate a blockchain transfer." Preston did not turn around. He began tapping the screen even faster, panic radiating from his entire body. The screen reflected in the dim light, showing the red error messages popping up on his banking application. "Access denied. Protocol overridden." He tapped the screen harder, his breathing becoming loud and erratic in the quiet room. From the shadows near the back of the room, Elias Thorne finally stepped forward. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. He walked past my stunned mother, past my hyperventilating father, and stopped directly behind Preston. Elias looked over Preston's trembling shoulder at the glowing screen filled with red access denial codes. He let out a low, soft laugh that sent a visible shiver down Preston's spine. "Do not bother, Preston," Elias said, his deep, resonant voice echoing with absolute crushing finality. "My bank froze your offshore accounts 30 minutes ago. You have $0.0 to your name." The absolute finality in Elias Thorne's voice hung in the air like a physical weight pressing down on the room until the silence became deafening. Preston's smartphone slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers and clattered onto the mahogany table. The device bounced once before landing face down in a puddle of spilled burgundy wine. Preston did not try to retrieve it. His knees buckled completely and he sank down to the floor, his expensive suit crumpling around him. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a wretched hollow sound that was somewhere between a sob and a gasp for air. He was entirely broken, a hollow shell of a man who had just watched his escape route incinerate before his very eyes. Jasmine stood over him, her face a mask of absolute revulsion. She took a deliberate step backward, pulling the hem of her silk gown away from him, as if his sudden poverty were a contagious disease. She offered him no comfort. She offered him no loyalty. The golden couple, the envy of the Manhattan elite, had disintegrated in less than 3 minutes. From the other end of the room, my father watched Preston grovel on the floor. I saw the exact moment the gears in Reginald's mind finally snapped back into place. His panic, which had been suffocating him just moments prior, suddenly morphed into a calculating, desperate fury. Reginald was a survivor of the corporate jungle. He had spent 35 years stepping on the throats of his competitors to build his empire. He looked at the weeping man on the floor, and he did not see a son-in-law. He saw a scapegoat. He saw a human shield. Reginald straightened his posture forcefully, rolling his shoulders back. He adjusted his tie, his face darkening with a manufactured righteous indignation. He stepped away from his chair, walking past the shattered crystal and the ruined dinner settings, positioning himself squarely in the center of the room. He wanted the board of directors to see him clearly. He wanted to project the image of a betrayed patriarch, a noble king who had been stabbed in the back by a treacherous subject. "You parasitic, thieving colonizer!" Reginald roared, his voice booming with the aggressive, theatrical cadence he used to dominate shareholder meetings. He pointed a stiff, accusing finger down at Preston's trembling form. The venom in my father's voice was absolute. He was fully leaning into the narrative, weaponizing the very racial dynamics he usually tried to gloss over in his pursuit of white corporate acceptance. "I welcomed you into my home," Reginald bellowed, pacing back and forth, making sure Arthur Sterling and the other executives were hanging on his every word. "I took you out of obscurity. I gave you my daughter. I gave you a senior partnership at a prominent Black-owned legacy firm. A firm that I built from the ground up, fighting tooth and nail against a system designed to see me fail. And this is how you repay me. You come into my house, you eat at my table, and you siphon the lifeblood out of my community. You stole from my elite clients to fund your pathetic, insecure ego." Reginald turned away from Preston and faced the board of directors. He threw his arms open wide, adopting a pose of profound, wounded leadership. "Gentlemen, you are witnessing the ultimate betrayal," my father declared, his voice vibrating with practiced emotional resonance. "I am as shocked and horrified as you are. This man is a rogue actor. He is a criminal who abused the unprecedented trust I placed in him. He manipulated our systems and betrayed the fundamental values of this institution. But we will not let one treacherous individual destroy what we have built. We will excise this cancer." Reginald slammed his fist against his open palm, his eyes flashing with a desperate, manic energy. "We will throw him to the federal authorities on Monday morning," my father promised the room, his voice rising in a crescendo of false authority. "We will claim total ignorance of his unauthorized actions. We will cooperate fully with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we will demonstrate that this firm was the victim of a sophisticated, isolated fraud. We will rebuild our reputation and we will emerge stronger." Arthur Sterling did not move. He stood completely still behind my right shoulder, his face carved from stone. He did not offer my father a nod of agreement. He did not offer a murmur of support. The silence from the board was absolute and terrifying. I let my father's ridiculous, blustering speech hang in the air for a few seconds. I let him taste the illusion of control. Then I shattered it. "You cannot claim ignorance when your ink is on the murder weapon, Reginald," I said, my voice cutting through his theatrical performance like a scalpel. My father froze. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his chest heaving. The false bravado melted from his features, replaced by a sudden sharp spike of terror. I picked up the thick leather-bound forensic dossier from the table. I did not open it. I simply held it in my hands, feeling the weight of the evidence that was about to permanently end his career. "You want to stand in front of this board and play the victim?" I asked, my tone flat, clinical, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You want to pretend you were a noble, trusting patriarch deceived by a rogue employee. That narrative might work at a country club dinner, but it does not work in federal court. And it certainly does not work against a forensic audit." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Reginald instinctively took a step backward, his eyes darting from my face to the dossier in my hands. "Let us talk about corporate liability." I continued, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the room. "Let us talk about the legal obligations of a chief executive officer." Preston did not steal those $34 million overnight. He siphoned that capital systematically over the course of 36 months. He bled your elite client trust accounts dry across 12 consecutive financial quarters. I tossed the dossier back onto the table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "And at the end of every single one of those 12 quarters, I stated, my eyes locking onto his, you authorized the financial disclosures. You signed the mandatory regulatory compliance forms. You placed your signature on the official audits, verifying that the firm's assets were secure, accurate, and fully accounted for." Reginald's jaw dropped. A sickly gray pallor washed over his face. He looked at Arthur Sterling, but the senior investor simply turned his head away in utter disgust. "For 3 years," I said, raising my voice just enough to command absolute silence. "You personally signed off on fraudulent financial statements. You did not read the reports. You did not verify the internal risk assessments. You were too busy playing golf with Martin Davis and micromanaging my mother's social calendar to actually do your job. You handed your fiduciary duty to a man who was robbing you blind, and then you legally rubber-stamped his crimes. The Securities and Exchange Commission will not view you as a victim, Reginald. They will view you as an accessory. You are legally liable for every single missing dollar." My father began to shake. The absolute certainty of my words dismantled the last remaining pillars of his reality. He was not going to be the hero who saved the firm. He was going to be the negligent executive facing federal indictments and the total liquidation of his personal assets. "That is not true." Reginald stammered, his voice rising in pitch, cracking under the crushing weight of his impending ruin. He backed away from me, waving his hands frantically in front of his chest. I did not know. I relied on the experts. The internal auditing department reviewed those files. They gave me the quarterly assessments. He spun around to face the board members, his eyes wide and pleading. "The external accounting firm signed off on the ledgers," Reginald shouted, his voice echoing with sheer, unadulterated panic. "They gave us a clean bill of health every single year. The auditors told me the accounts were balanced. I relied on their reports. I am the chief executive officer. I cannot review every single algorithm. They gave me clean reports. They lied to me." I watched him thrash against the inevitable. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own incompetence, frantically grabbing at anyone he could pull down with him. I leaned heavily across the mahogany table, resting my weight on my hands. I stared directly at my father, letting a slow, chilling smile touch the corners of my mouth. "I know they did, Dad," I said softly, my voice laced with dark, lethal precision. "I know the auditors gave you clean reports. I have the digital copies of every single falsified document they handed you." Reginald stopped waving his hands. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his mind completely unable to process the angle of my attack. "But the real question," I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "is not what the auditors missed. The real question is not how Preston managed to hide his theft inside my old code." I slowly pushed myself off the table, standing up to my full height. The dining room was so quiet, I could hear the rapid, terrified breathing of my sister standing just a few feet away. "The real question," I said, letting the silence stretch out for a fraction of a second, "is who forced the auditors to look the other way?" I did not wait for my father to respond. I did not look at Preston groveling on the floor. I slowly turned my head, shifting my gaze away from Reginald's sweating, panicked face. I looked past the shattered crystal, past the spilled wine, and locked my eyes dead onto the woman standing completely frozen in the shadows near the back wall. I turned my gaze slowly to my mother. Vivian stood completely paralyzed, perfectly framed by the absolute chaos of the ruined dining room. The heavy, suffocating silence seemed to press directly against her chest, extinguishing the last remaining breaths of her manufactured elegance. For my entire life, my mother had been an impenetrable fortress of high society standards and ruthless social calculation. She was a woman who would rather endure physical agony than display a single ounce of genuine vulnerability in front of her wealthy peers. But as the full weight of my accusations settled over the shattered room, I watched the structural integrity of her pristine facade crack and violently give way. Her perfectly manicured hands, adorned with massive diamonds bought by the very firm that was currently collapsing, began to shake. She clutched her expensive silk shawl tightly against her throat, as if trying to shield herself from the sheer force of my gaze. She opened her mouth to speak, to deploy another masterclass in emotional manipulation, but her vocal cords simply refused to cooperate. Reginald turned his head slowly, his eyes darting frantically from my face to Vivian's trembling form. He looked like a man waking up inside a burning house, completely disoriented and searching for an exit that did not exist. The blustering, domineering patriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified executive who suddenly realized the call was coming from inside the house. Vivian Reginald choked out his voice, a hoarse, unrecognizable rasp that scraped against the quiet walls. Vivian, what is she talking about? Tell me she is lying. Tell these men that this bitter, vindictive girl is lying to us. Vivian did not look at him. She could not look at the board of directors. She kept her eyes glued to the mahogany floor, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The color had drained from her face, leaving her expensive makeup sitting like a harsh mask over pale, terrified skin. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, my heels sinking into the plush carpet. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I commanded the gravity of the room with effortless precision. Tell him, Vivian. I demanded, the words echoing with icy authority. Tell the chief executive officer exactly how you managed his blind spots. Tell him how you intercepted the preliminary audit reports before they ever reached his desk. You thought Preston was the mastermind of this operation, but Preston is nothing more than a coward with a gambling problem and a luxury car addiction. He did not have the access, the clearance, or the authority to silence an external accounting firm. But you did. The dam finally broke. A ragged, ugly sob tore from Vivian's throat, completely destroying decades of carefully cultivated poise. She covered her face with both hands, her shoulders heaving violently as the toxic truth finally spilled out into the open air. I had to. Vivian wailed, the sound entirely pathetic and desperate. I had to protect her. I had to protect our image. Protect who? Reginald bellowed, staggering forward and grabbing the back of his chair to keep his knees from buckling. He stared at his wife as if she had suddenly transformed into a monster. Protect who, Vivian? She dropped her hands, revealing a face streaked with ruined mascara and sheer terror. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my sister, who was standing frozen against the far wall. Jasmine! Vivian cried out, her voice cracking under the strain. I was protecting Jasmine. I saw the bank statements, Reginald. 2 years ago, I accidentally opened a portfolio summary that Preston had carelessly left on the kitchen counter at the summer house. I saw the massive deficits. I saw the shell companies. I realized he was bleeding the client trust accounts dry. Arthur Sterling let out a sharp, disgusted breath. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, pulling further away from my family. They were realizing that the rot in this firm went far deeper than mere executive negligence. It was an active, coordinated familial conspiracy. And instead of telling your husband, I interjected smoothly, taking another step forward. Instead of alerting the board and saving the legacy you claim to cherish so deeply, you decided to become an accomplice. You used your position as the founder's wife to apply leverage. You knew the lead external auditor was going through a brutal divorce and facing his own financial ruin. You used the family's immense social influence to guarantee his silence, ensuring that the final reports handed to Reginald were scrubbed completely clean. You facilitated the theft. Vivian nodded frantically, tears pouring down her cheeks. She turned toward the board members, holding her hands out desperately, trying to elicit sympathy from men who were currently calculating their own federal defense strategies. You do not understand the pressure we are under. Vivian sobbed, her voice echoing with profound absolute delusion. We are the pinnacle of Black society in this city. Jasmine is the face of that excellence. She sits on the board of the ballet. She chairs the museum gala. If the city found out her husband was bankrupt, if they found out he was a common thief, we would be entirely ruined. The humiliation would have destroyed us. The country club would have stripped our membership immediately. The women who smile at me at charity luncheons would have laughed behind my back. I could not let my golden child be dragged through the mud. I could not let them take her home, her cars, and her dignity. Her dignity. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. I stepped into her personal space, forcing her to look at the daughter she had deemed unworthy of her protection. You sold out your husband's entire company. You risked federal prison. You allowed $34 million of innocent people's money to be stolen simply to protect a country club membership. You chose optics over integrity, Vivian. You sacrificed the actual, tangible foundation of this family just to keep the paint looking fresh. Jasmine stared at her mother, completely horrified. The reality of her entire existence was collapsing around her. You knew, Jasmine whispered, her voice trembling with shock. You knew Preston was stealing, and you let me keep spending. You let me sign those wire transfers for the fake charities. I was buying time. Vivian cried out, reaching a desperate hand toward Jasmine. I thought Preston could fix it. I thought he was smart enough to trade his way out of the deficit. I was just trying to buy him enough time to replace the funds before anyone noticed. I did it for you, Jasmine. I did it so you could keep your life. Reginald let out a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It was the sound of a man watching his entire life's work evaporate. You forged my approval, he gasped, clutching his chest as he stared at his wife. You manipulated the internal reviews. You let me sign my own death warrant. You let me walk blindly into a federal indictment just to protect a daughter who cares about nothing but herself. I did it for the family, Vivian shrieked, spinning back to face me. The desperation in her eyes reached a fever pitch. She looked at the cold, unyielding faces of the board members. She looked at the absolute disgust radiating from Elias Thorne. She looked at the total lack of mercy in my posture. In that terrible, clarifying moment, Vivian realized that there was no social manipulation left to play. There was no lie, no excuse, and no tearful plea that could save her from the federal authorities. Her empire of optics was completely dead. The only thing left in the world that possessed the power to save her was the immense, untouchable wealth sitting in my bank accounts. Vivian's knees gave out. The proud, arrogant matriarch who had dictated my wardrobe mocked my natural hair and forced me to stand in service hallways because I was an embarrassment to her brand, completely surrendered her dignity. She collapsed heavily onto the floor. The expensive silk of her designer dress soaked up the spilled red wine, staining her knees a deep, violent crimson. She crawled across the ruined carpet, her hands outstretched, desperately reaching to grab the hem of my skirt. I stepped back smoothly, avoiding her touch with effortless, chilling disgust. She dropped her head toward the floor, openly weeping, abandoning every shred of the black excellence she had weaponized against me for 3 decades. Grace, please, Vivian wailed, her voice echoing with raw, pathetic desperation. You have billions. You bought the bank. You hold all the debt. You can fix this right now. You can buy the firm immediately. Inject your capital into the accounts. Replace the missing $34 million before the SEC arrives on Monday morning. You can bury the forensic audit. You can pay off the board. You can make this all go away. She looked up at me from the floor, her face completely undone, a grotesque mask of running makeup and pure terror. She clasped her hands together, holding them up to me in a pathetic gesture of prayer. We are your family, Grace, she begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal. We are your blood. You have to save us. The absolute finality in Elias Thorne's voice hung in the air like a physical weight pressing down on the room until the silence became deafening. Preston's smartphone slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers and clattered onto the mahogany table. The device bounced once before landing face down in a puddle of spilled burgundy wine. Preston did not try to retrieve it. His knees buckled completely, and he sank down to the floor, his expensive suit crumpling around him. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a wretched, hollow sound that was somewhere between a sob and a gasp for air. He was entirely broken, a hollow shell of a man who had just watched his escape route incinerate before his very eyes. Jasmine stood over him, her face a mask of absolute revulsion. She took a deliberate step backward, pulling the hem of her silk gown away from him, as if his sudden poverty were a contagious disease. She offered him no comfort. She offered him no loyalty. The golden couple, the envy of the Manhattan elite, had disintegrated in less than 3 minutes. From the other end of the room, my father watched Preston grovel on the floor. I saw the exact moment the gears in Reginald's mind finally snapped back into place. His panic, which had been suffocating him just moments prior, suddenly morphed into a calculating, desperate fury. Reginald was a survivor of the corporate jungle. He had spent 35 years stepping on the throats of his competitors to build his empire. He looked at the weeping man on the floor, and he did not see a son-in-law. He saw a scapegoat. He saw a human shield. Reginald straightened his posture forcefully, rolling his shoulders back. He adjusted his tie, his face darkening with a manufactured righteous indignation. He stepped away from his chair, walking past the shattered crystal and the ruined dinner settings, positioning himself squarely in the center of the room. He wanted the board of directors to see him clearly. He wanted to project the image of a betrayed patriarch, a noble king who had been stabbed in the back by a treacherous subject. "You parasitic, thieving colonizer!" Reginald roared, his voice booming with the aggressive theatrical cadence he used to dominate shareholder meetings. He pointed a stiff, accusing finger down at Preston's trembling form. The venom in my father's voice was absolute. He was fully leaning into the narrative, weaponizing the very racial dynamics he usually tried to gloss over in his pursuit of white corporate acceptance. "I welcomed you into my home," Reginald bellowed, pacing back and forth, making sure Arthur Sterling and the other executives were hanging on his every word. "I took you out of obscurity. I gave you my daughter. I gave you a senior partnership at a prominent Black-owned legacy firm. A firm that I built from the ground up, fighting tooth and nail against a system designed to see me fail. And this is how you repay me. You come into my house, you eat at my table, and you siphon the lifeblood out of my community. You stole from my elite clients to fund your pathetic, insecure ego." Reginald turned away from Preston and faced the board of directors. He threw his arms open wide, adopting a pose of profound, wounded leadership. "Gentlemen, you are witnessing the ultimate betrayal," my father declared, his voice vibrating with practiced emotional resonance. "I am as shocked and horrified as you are. This man is a rogue actor. He is a criminal who abused the unprecedented trust I placed in him. He manipulated our systems and betrayed the fundamental values of this institution. But we will not let one treacherous individual destroy what we have built. We will excise this cancer." Reginald slammed his fist against his open palm, his eyes flashing with a desperate, manic energy. "We will throw him to the federal authorities on Monday morning." My father promised the room, his voice rising in a crescendo of false authority. "We will claim total ignorance of his unauthorized actions. We will cooperate fully with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we will demonstrate that this firm was the victim of a sophisticated, isolated fraud. We will rebuild our reputation, and we will emerge stronger." Arthur Sterling did not move. He stood completely still behind my right shoulder, his face carved from stone. He did not offer my father a nod of agreement. He did not offer a murmur of support. The silence from the board was absolute and terrifying. I let my father's ridiculous, blustering speech hang in the air for a few seconds. I let him taste the illusion of control. Then I shattered it. "You cannot claim ignorance when your ink is on the murder weapon, Reginald," I said, my voice cutting through his theatrical performance like a scalpel. My father froze. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his chest heaving. The false bravado melted from his features, replaced by a sudden sharp spike of terror. I picked up the thick, leather-bound forensic dossier from the table. I did not open it. I simply held it in my hands, feeling the weight of the evidence that was about to permanently end his career. "You want to stand in front of this board and play the victim?" I asked, my tone flat, clinical, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You want to pretend you were a noble, trusting patriarch deceived by a rogue employee? That narrative might work at a country club dinner, but it does not work in federal court, and it certainly does not work against a forensic audit." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Reginald instinctively took a step backward, his eyes darting from my face to the dossier in my hands. "Let us talk about corporate liability," I continued, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the room. "Let us talk about the legal obligations of a chief executive officer." Preston did not steal those $34 million overnight. He siphoned that capital systematically over the course of 36 months. He bled your elite client trust accounts dry across 12 consecutive financial quarters. I tossed the dossier back onto the table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. And at the end of every single one of those 12 quarters, I stated, my eyes locking onto his, "You authorized the financial disclosures. You signed the mandatory regulatory compliance forms. You placed your signature on the official audits, verifying that the firm's assets were secure, accurate, and fully accounted for." Reginald's jaw dropped. A sickly gray pallor washed over his face. He looked at Arthur Sterling, but the senior investor simply turned his head away in utter disgust. "For 3 years," I said, raising my voice just enough to command absolute silence. "You personally signed off on fraudulent financial statements. You did not read the reports. You did not verify the internal risk assessments. You were too busy playing golf with Martin Davis and micromanaging my mother's social calendar to actually do your job. You handed your fiduciary duty to a man who was robbing you blind, and then you legally rubber-stamped his crimes. The Securities and Exchange Commission will not view you as a victim, Reginald. They will view you as an accessory. You are legally liable for every single missing dollar." My father began to shake. The absolute certainty of my words dismantled the last remaining pillars of his reality. He was not going to be the hero who saved the firm. He was going to be the negligent executive facing federal indictments and the total liquidation of his personal assets. "That is not true," Reginald stammered, his voice rising in pitch, cracking under the crushing weight of his impending ruin. He backed away from me, waving his hands frantically in front of his chest. "I did not know. I relied on the experts. The internal auditing department reviewed those files. They gave me the quarterly assessments." He spun around to face the board members, his eyes wide and pleading. "The external accounting firm signed off on the ledgers," Reginald shouted, his voice echoing with sheer, unadulterated panic. "They gave us a clean bill of health every single year. The auditors told me the accounts were balanced. I relied on their reports. I am the chief executive officer. I cannot review every single algorithm. They gave me clean reports. They lied to me." I watched him thrash against the inevitable. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own incompetence, frantically grabbing at anyone he could pull down with him. I leaned heavily across the mahogany table, resting my weight on my hands. I stared directly at my father, letting a slow, chilling smile touch the corners of my mouth. "I know they did, Dad," I said softly, my voice laced with dark, lethal precision. "I know the auditors gave you clean reports. I have the digital copies of every single falsified document they handed you." Reginald stopped waving his hands. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his mind completely unable to process the angle of my attack. "But the real question," I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "is not what the auditors missed. The real question is not how Preston managed to hide his theft inside my old code." I slowly pushed myself off the table, standing up to my full height. The dining room was so quiet, I could hear the rapid, terrified breathing of my sister standing just a few feet away. "The real question," I said, letting the silence stretch out for a fraction of a second, "is who forced the auditors to look the other way?" I did not wait for my father to respond. I did not look at Preston groveling on the floor. I slowly turned my head, shifting my gaze away from Reginald's sweating, panicked face. I looked past the shattered crystal, past the spilled wine, and locked my eyes dead onto the woman standing completely frozen in the shadows near the back wall. I turned my gaze slowly to my mother. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like an unwelcome guest in my own family. Vivian was sobbing uncontrollably, now her tear-stained face pressing against the polished mahogany floor. Her pleas for salvation were not born of remorse for the lives she had helped ruin. They were born of absolute terror. She was not crying for the millions of dollars stolen from innocent people. She was crying because her country club membership was about to be revoked. I did not reach out to comfort her. I did not offer her a single ounce of the absolution she was desperately begging for. I took another deliberate step backward, ensuring the hem of my dress remained entirely out of her frantic, grasping reach. "Save you," I repeated, my voice devoid of any warmth. "You want me to save you so you can continue hosting charity luncheons funded by stolen money. You are pathetic, Vivian." Reginald watched his wife grovel on the floor, and the last remaining fragments of his towering, carefully constructed ego finally shattered. The blustering tyrant, the man who had commanded boardrooms and terrified junior partners for decades, simply ceased to exist. His broad shoulders slumped forward, pulling his entire frame down into a posture of profound, humiliating defeat. He suddenly looked like a very old, very tired man. He stepped around Vivian, his polished leather shoes carefully avoiding her, as if her failure were a contagious disease, and he moved toward me. His hands were open palms facing upward in a gesture of total surrender. "Grace." Reginald began, his voice stripped of its usual booming resonance, replaced by a reedy, desperate tremor. "Grace, please, listen to me." I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, watching the man who had dismissed my entire existence, reduced to a beggar in his own boardroom. "You are right," Reginald stammered, licking his dry lips, his eyes darting frantically toward Arthur Sterling and the other silent board members, before returning to me. "You are absolutely right. We are ruined. The firm is insolvent. If those auditors talk, if the federal authorities walk through those doors on Monday morning, everything I have built for the last 35 years is gone. But it does not have to be this way. You have the capital, Grace. You have billions. You bought out the major shareholders. You hold all the leverage." He took another step closer, lowering his voice into a frantic, hushed pitch, as if he could somehow keep the rest of the room from witnessing his complete capitulation. "You can fix this," he pleaded, his hands shaking as he held them out to me. "You can inject the $34 million into the trust accounts right now. Plug the hole Preston created. Buy the controlling shares of the firm. You can take absolute control of the back-end operations. Restructure the board, fire whoever you want, install your own executives. The company will be entirely yours. I will give you everything." I tilted my head, studying his face. "And what exactly do you want in return for this generous offer of surrendering a bankrupt criminal enterprise to me, Dad?" Reginald swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing the deep lines around his mouth. "Just let me stay," he whispered, the sheer vanity of his request hanging heavily in the tense air. "Let me stay on as the public-facing chief executive officer. In name only, Grace. Just for the optics. I will not touch the finances. I will not make a single operational decision without your explicit approval. You can treat me as an employee. But you cannot throw me out. You cannot let the city see me fail like this. My friends, the country club, the legacy I have curated in this city, I cannot endure the humiliation of being ousted. Let me keep my title. Let me keep my dignity." I stared at him, genuinely astounded by the depths of his delusion. Even now, standing in the wreckage of a massive federal crime facing the total destruction of his firm and the imminent arrest of his son-in-law, Reginald's only true concern was how he would look at his next golf tournament. "Your dignity." I asked, my tone sharp and clinical. "Your dignity was compromised the moment you allowed Preston to rob your clients blind." When he saw my expression remain entirely unmoved, Reginald reached for his final, most desperate weapon. He tried to invoke a shared struggle that he had spent his entire life trying to buy his way out of. He straightened his posture slightly, desperately trying to summon the ghost of his former authority, and he attempted to weaponize our race. "You do not understand what is at stake here," Reginald said, his voice taking on a tone of forced, intimate solidarity. "We are Black Grace. Do you understand what that means in this city? Do you understand how hard I had to fight to build a legacy firm in a world that wanted to see me fail? The corporate establishment is just waiting for an excuse to tear us down. If this firm collapses, if a Black-owned institution goes under because of an embezzlement scandal, it is a stain on our entire community. It validates every prejudiced assumption they have ever made about us." He stepped closer, his eyes pleading, trying to force me into a corner of racial guilt. "They want to see us fall," he insisted, gesturing wildly to the room. "If I go down in handcuffs, if the federal agents drag me out of this building, it hurts all of us. We have to stick together, Grace. We have to protect our own. You cannot let the white establishment watch this family be destroyed. You have a responsibility to your people to save this legacy." The sheer audacity of his hypocrisy was suffocating. I felt a cold, hard knot of absolute disgust tighten in my chest. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute zero temperature of my tone silenced him instantly. "Do not dare invoke our people to justify your crimes, Reginald," I said, each word landing like a physical strike. "You do not care about the community. You care about your pride. You allowed your white son-in-law to systematically bleed the accounts of elderly Black widows, overseas heirs, and generational trusts. You stole from the very people you claim to represent simply to fund your wife's charity galas and maintain your precious social standing." Reginald opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off completely. "Do you honestly think the federal investigators will not find the transfer logs?" I asked, my voice ringing with total authority. "I have already secured the digital footprints. The encrypted ledgers titled A_15B_15 and C_15 have all been decrypted, analyzed, and handed directly over to my forensic team. There is no hiding from this. There is no spinning the optics. The evidence is absolute." Reginald's eyes widened in sheer terror at the mention of the specific encrypted ledgers. His jaw worked silently, but no sound emerged. The last remaining air deflated from his lungs. I opened my designer purse, the sharp click of the clasp echoing in the quiet room. I reached inside and pulled out a sleek, heavy titanium pen and a single crisp sheet of paper. I did not look at my mother, who was still weeping quietly on the floor. I did not look at Preston, who remained curled in a pathetic ball. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my father. I placed the single sheet of paper onto the polished mahogany table right next to the massive forensic dossier. The white paper stood out starkly against the dark wood. "You do not care about our people, Dad," I repeated, my voice steady, cold, and final. "You only care about your pride." I slid the paper across the table. It came to a smooth stop directly in front of him. "This is a termination agreement," I stated, holding the titanium pen out toward him. "It strips you of your title as Chief Executive Officer. It liquidates your remaining equity in this firm, and it transfers absolute, unconditional control of this entire corporation directly to me, effective immediately. You will step down tonight. You will release a public statement citing health reasons on Monday morning. You will never set foot in this building again." Reginald stared down at the paper as if it were a loaded weapon. His hands were shaking so badly he could not bring himself to reach for the pen I was offering. "You cannot do this to me," he whispered, a single tear breaking loose and rolling down his cheek. "I am your father." I leaned forward, placing the pen onto the center of the termination agreement. I looked him dead in the eyes, stripping away the last illusion of his power. "Sign it," I commanded, the finality in my voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Sign it or you go to federal prison with Preston." The heavy titanium pen felt like an anchor in Reginald's trembling hand. He stared down at the crisp white sheet of paper that represented the total surrender of his empire, his identity, and his unchecked power. For 35 years, his signature had moved markets, commanded respect, and terrified subordinates. Now it was the only thing standing between him and a federal prison cell. He looked up at me one last time, his eyes searching my face for a flicker of the desperate approval-seeking daughter he had manipulated for decades. He found absolutely nothing but cold, impenetrable resolve. With a ragged, defeated exhale that sounded like a tire losing its final pound of pressure, Reginald lowered his head. The scratch of the metal nib against the paper was the loudest sound in the room. He signed his name effectively, firing himself from the company he had built, severing his legal authority, and handing the keys of his kingdom directly to me. I did not smile. I simply reached forward and pulled the termination agreement across the polished mahogany. I blew softly on the wet ink, folded the document with precise, deliberate movements, and slid it into my purse. My gaze shifted from my broken father to the man still curled on the floor. Preston had stopped sobbing, but he remained completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of his situation. I reached into my purse a second time and withdrew a smaller standard corporate envelope. I dropped it onto the floor. It landed mere inches from Preston's face. "You do not get a negotiation, Preston," I stated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "That is your formal notice of immediate termination with extreme prejudice. You are stripped of all corporate access, all firm privileges, and all legal protections. You are entirely on your own." The reality of those words finally broke through the shock, suffocating my sister. Jasmine had watched her husband's fraud exposed, her mother's complicity revealed, and her father's empire signed away in a matter of minutes. The protective bubble of her immense privilege had violently popped, exposing her to the brutal, unforgiving consequences of the real world. She let out a feral, ear-piercing scream. It was not the calculated, theatrical outrage she usually employed to get her way. It was a sound of pure, unhinged madness. Jasmine lunged across the ruined dining table, her hands hooked into claws, her face twisted in absolute fury. She scrambled over the shattered crystal and spilled wine, launching herself directly at my throat. I did not take a single step backward. I did not even blink. Before Jasmine could clear the edge of the table, two massive figures stepped out of the periphery shadows with terrifying speed. Elias Thorne's private security detail moved effortlessly, catching Jasmine mid-lunge. They clamped down on her arms, lifting her completely off her feet. She thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive heels against the air, screaming obscenities that echoed violently in the private dining room. "You ruined us!" Jasmine shrieked, her face turning a blotchy, ugly purple as she fought hopelessly against the unmoving guards. "You jealous, vindictive monster. You destroyed our lives. We have nothing because of you." I stood perfectly still, watching her thrash with cold, clinical detachment. "I did not destroy anything, Jasmine," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "Your husband chose to steal. Your mother chose to commit fraud. Your father chose to turn a blind eye. You all built a house out of matches and soaked it in gasoline. I did not light the fire. I just handed you the bill." I paused, turning my head slightly toward the heavy oak doors at the entrance of the private dining room. "Oh, and speaking of bills," I added softly. 3 heavy rhythmic knocks echoed from the solid wood. The sound was sharp, authoritative, and completely out of place in the exclusive, hushed atmosphere of Le Bernardin. The remaining board members, who had been huddled in terrified silence, jumped at the noise. Arthur Sterling actually took a step backward, his face draining of whatever color it had left. The heavy oak doors swung open violently. The maitre d' had been shoved aside, replaced by a line of individuals who did not care about Michelin stars or strict dress codes. 5 federal agents wearing navy windbreakers, with SEC emblazoned across the back, stepped into the room, immediately followed by 4 uniformed officers of the New York Police Department. The radio chatter from their shoulder mics cut through the suffocating tension, bringing the harsh, undeniable reality of the outside world directly into my family's private sanctuary. Elias Thorne stepped forward, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. He looked at the lead federal agent and offered a single crisp nod. Elias had tipped them off hours ago, providing the exact coordinates of Preston's location and the digital roadmap to the Cayman Island accounts. We had orchestrated this precise timeline to ensure the trap snapped shut the moment Reginald relinquished control of the firm. Preston Blackwood, the lead agent, announced, his voice carrying the absolute uncompromising weight of federal authority. Step away from the table and keep your hands where we can see them. Preston did not need to step away from the table. He was already on the floor. Two NYPD officers moved forward rapidly, hauling Preston to his feet by his armpits. They slammed him against the mahogany wall, pulled his arms behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent room. As the officer began reading Preston his Miranda rights, detailing the charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, the final thread holding Jasmine together completely snapped. She stopped fighting the security guards. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed into a sobbing, hysterical mess on the carpet, her expensive gown soaking up the spilled wine. She wailed a terrible, desperate sound, reaching out toward the husband she had just publicly disowned minutes prior. Vivian remained frozen on her knees, staring blankly at the federal agents securing the room. Reginald sat slumped in his chair, his eyes glassy and vacant as he watched the authorities dismantle his legacy. The board members did not wait to be dismissed. Arthur Sterling grabbed his briefcase, completely ignoring Reginald, and rushed toward the exit. The other executives followed suit, keeping their heads down, scrambling to distance themselves from the toxic radioactive fallout of the Blackwell family. They scattered like roaches, fleeing the light, leaving my parents entirely isolated in the wreckage of their destroyed empire. As the officers turned Preston around to march him out the door, Reginald slowly lifted his head. His face was a mask of absolute devastation. He looked at me, genuine tears pooling in his eyes, completely unable to comprehend the magnitude of his defeat. Grace, Reginald whispered, his voice trembling with a pathetic, manufactured sorrow. Look at your mother. Look at your sister. Do you feel any remorse for what you have done to your own blood? The question was designed to inflict guilt, to find a crack in my armor, to make me carry the weight of their choices. I looked down at the people who had abused, marginalized, and dismissed me for 35 years. I looked at the mother who had prioritized high society optics over her daughter's well-being. I looked at the sister who had gloated over my struggles. I looked at the father who had demanded my absolute obedience while actively plotting my financial ruin. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I felt absolutely, unequivocally weightless. Remorse is for people who break things. I said, my voice carrying the steady, resonant power of a woman who had finally reclaimed her entire life. I did not break this family, Dad. You did. I just stopped paying for the glue. I did not offer a final gloating smirk. I did not wait for his response. I simply turned my back on them. I picked up my designer coat from the back of my chair and slid it over my shoulders, smoothing the fabric with effortless precision. I looked at Elias Thorne, who was watching me with an expression of profound, quiet respect. Thank you for your excellent partnership, Elias, I said, offering him a brief, genuine smile. Always a pleasure, Grace, he replied, stepping aside to clear my path. I walked out of the private dining room, the sharp click of my heels ringing against the marble floor. I did not look back at the chaotic scene behind me. I left the sobbing, the screaming, and the desperate, frantic pleading exactly where it belonged in the past. I stepped out through the front doors of the restaurant and inhaled deeply. The crisp, freezing New York winter air hit my face sharp and incredibly clean. It tasted like absolute victory. The valet immediately stepped forward, pulling open the heavy rear door of my waiting Maybach. I slid into the plush leather seat, the quiet luxury of the cabin immediately insulating me from the noise of the city. I was completely free. I was entirely untouchable. I was firmly in control of my own billion-dollar empire, and I would never apologize for my success again. The heavy door closed with a solid, reassuring thud, and the car pulled smoothly away from the curb, disappearing into the brilliant, endless lights of the city. The greatest lesson from this story is that true power stems from financial independence and strong personal boundaries. You cannot heal in the environment that breaks you, and biological ties never excuse manipulation or emotional abuse. Forgiveness remains a personal choice for your peace of mind, but reconciliation requires accountability that toxic family members rarely offer. Sometimes the absolute most profound act of true respect is simply walking away to build your own empire from the ashes of their selfish expectations. If this dramatic story resonated with you today, please hit like, subscribe, and share your experiences down below now.